My father was a quiet, serious man. Like other members of his family, compliments were rarely given, and sarcasm rolled off his tongue when he spoke. Typically, for the men of his generation, words of affection were considered unnecessary. Most of my childhood memories of him was of familiar disquiet, tiptoeing, and choosing words carefully to avoid the harsh stings of his blunt criticisms. Once I became an adult, the silent space was filled with alcohol and food. The amber scotch pouring into the glass, sizzling of the oil glazing the pan, smell of various ingredients replacing words as conversation. One of my favorite dishes was the okonomiyaki, a savory Japanese pancake. The best okonomiyaki came from the Kansai region of Japan, where my dad spent most of his life. Filled with shredded cabbage, enveloped in an egg, potato, and flour-based batter, it was topped with thinly sliced beef, pork, or seafood, finished with a sprinkling of green flake nori, bonito flakes, mayonnaise, and a thicker, sweeter version of the Worcester sauce. My dad loved to say okonomiyaki was practical, manly food for busy, productive folks. He was a proud Kansai man, and this was the proud of Kansai. Quick, filling, and unpretentious, it was the perfect food for the region of Japan known for thick-skinned merchants who replaced the polite formality of Japanese culture with sarcasm and pointed, sometimes over-the-top sass. When my dad would visit, he would always take a night out to make me okonomiyaki. His final visit to the state was no exception. It was the end of March 2009, and he handed me a grocery list in the morning, announcing that he would cook that night. I threw a few beer glasses in the fridge and trekked off alone to procure Japanese beer and sliced beef. Coming home, my dad grunted, motioned for me to pour him a drink. He made his way into the kitchen to shred the cabbage into fine threads. Once the cabbage was shredded, he reached for the beer, smiled, and took a long swig. I never helped my dad when he cooked. My job was to clean up. Grating the potatoes into the batter, my father said, "I know you can cook well these days, but old habits die hard." He handed me the potatoes, and for the first time, I grated the potatoes for okonomiyaki. Heating up the griddle, Dad mixed the cabbage and potatoes in with the egg and flour batter. He poured the mix in circles, and I watched the golden liquid bubble and burn. Once the batter was partially cooked, he laid down the meat, flipped the pancake on top to finish cooking. I waited with a plate in hand, the condiments placed in bowls on the table. Making our way back to the dining table, I continued to refill his beer while he complained, as usual, about my preference for dousing okonomiyaki in so much green nori that he doubted I could taste anything else. Looking at me, he asked if it was good. I nodded and filled the glass with more curing. He smiled, gave me a pat on the back. Sipping from his beer glass, he said, "You grated the potatoes perfectly, kid." Last summer, I went back to Japan to spend time with my father. The cancer had spread like wildfire, and he was now in hospice. Days were spent running errands and taking care of Dad, nights sleeping on a folding bed in his room. Most nights, Dad would wake and ask if I was awake before falling asleep again. That night, rubbing my eyes, I woke from my folding bed and sat on the chair next to him. Placing his hands on my shoulder, he sighed deeply, then said, "It's good to see you. Thanks for coming." The nurse call button cast an amber glow on his silver hair, reminding me of scotch, my dad's favorite drink. I pointed to the fridge, asking if he wanted a beer. Earlier, his doctor gave him permission to drink a beer a day. He nodded enthusiastically, and I poured a glass for each of us. We sat, sipping from our glass, the machines filling the silence with beeps and blips. Sipping the last of what would be his final glass of beer, he whispered, "Imo jouzu ni oroshita na." You grated the potatoes perfectly. Thanks, Dad, I replied. Looking into my face, my dad smiled. I'd like to make that for you again. Reaching across, he placed my hand on top of his hands and I squeezed gently. I'd love that, I replied. In that dark hospital room, we sat for a while, and I held his hand until he drifted into a heavy, medicated twilight. A few days after his funeral, I woke up at midnight. Suddenly famished, I tiptoed out of the hotel. Walking towards a bright lit okonomiyaki store, I poked my head in. The owner called out, "Take a seat, we're still open." I was a lone customer, and I planted myself in front of the large griddle. "One beef okonomiyaki, please." While he prepared my midnight meal, he peppered me with questions about my family and my life in the States. Slipping my meal onto the plate, he cut it into bite-sized pieces. As my chopsticks picked up a morsel, I said, "My dad used to cook okonomiyaki for me." The owner laughed. "That's a sign of a good Kansai father." I took a bite. Tears welling, I thought of my dad. Nibbling quietly, the flavors infused my brain, filling my head with memories. "Is your father in Japan?" he asked. I managed to choke out. I just returned from his funeral in Osaka just a few days ago. Nodding quietly, he gestures towards a bottle of beer. "On the house if you'd like a glass." Pouring a drink for each of us, he handed me my glass and raised his high. "To your father." He left me alone while I finished my meal. When I got up to leave, he wished me luck. I thanked him. He smiled. "Your father cooking for you was his way of saying he loved you." Smiling back, I nodded and stepped out into the street. "I love you too, Dad."